This dualism was also, as it was mentioned, was adopted by Christianity, where you have Satan, they have, and it's considered something evil and something good. Islam also adopted the Christian view, I guess, model of Satan. So, is it considered Avoda Zara to believe in more than one God, or let's say you don't believe in that you believe in the existence of them, but you only serve one of them or only see one of them as good, like Zoroastrianism? What is the definition that makes it Avoda Zara?
Well, the idea is that you have to believe that there is only one God that is supreme over every other power in the universe. There can be, theoretically, the acknowledgement of other powers, but those powers are subordinate, and God can withdraw their power at any given moment. So I wouldn't say that the Christian idea of Satan is per se Avoda Zara. There are other aspects of Christianity that are idolatry, such as the Trinity and the notion of God being corporeal, meaning having the attributes of a physical body. The issue of Satan, I would say, might be a mistaken idea, but it wouldn't automatically be an idolatrous idea. Now, with Zoroastrianism, they were positing literally the god of darkness, the force of darkness, the force of goodness. These were two competing, equal powers that one time, sometimes one wins, sometimes the other wins. So that certainly would be idolatrous in that way. Now, you'll recall, although it's not our really subject for now, that there is a very big machlokas among the Rishonim if Christianity is Avoda Zara for the Gentiles. There is a shita of Rabbeinu Tam, although there are different interpretations, who actually says that Christianity is not a violation of idolatry under the 7 Noahide laws, although it would be idolatry for a Jewish person to affirm it. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, that it's correct for Gentiles. It can't be correct for Goyim and incorrect for Jews, but it means that it's within the range of permissible mistakes that would not be tainted with idolatry. Now, that's a machlokas. The Rambam actually says in a censored passage that Christianity, this is pre-Reformation, so the Rambam was referring probably to Coptic Christianity, which was practiced in Egypt, or maybe even Roman Catholicism. But the Rambam does say it is idolatrous. But everybody admits that Islam is not an idolatrous religion. We have many problems with Islam, to be sure. And the Rambam talks about Muhammad the Meshuggah, Muhammad the crazy one, who has done worse for the Jews than any other nation that ever lived. But the one thing in their favor is they are not technically Ovdei Avoda Zara. Yeah.
Why wasn't the Torah given at the beginning of creation?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. Why was the Torah not given at the very beginning of creation, if indeed Hashem created the universe for the purpose of the Jewish people keeping the Torah, or some nation keeping the Torah? Then why did so many generations, 25 generations, go through the world until we have a Torah itself? So the truth of the matter is, the Torah was always part of the legacy of the righteous. We are told that the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, were able to perceive the Torah as part of the spiritual DNA of the universe. What you're talking about is not that there was no Torah until Revelation, but rather there was no open mandatory revelation, meaning to say, as the generations got worse and worse and spiritually inferior, they could no longer trust their intuition. They could no longer trust their reason. They could no longer trust their judgment to ascertain what the will of God was. So it had to be concretized in the form of definitive commandments. Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner, in the Nefesh HaChaim, makes a point which it's not entirely clear what he means, but he may be suggesting a very daring point. One of the famous discussions in rabbinic literature is this idea that the Avos kept the whole Torah before it was given, and yet we find that the Avos seemingly violated a lot of the Torah. So Yaakov married 2 sisters, right? Things like that. Or the Shvatim married their twin sisters and the like. And if you simply give an answer, well, that's before the Torah was given, but that doesn't suffice because the Avos kept the Torah before it was given. Many, many, many answers. One is the Ramban's thesis that before Matan Torah, The Avos only kept the Torah in Eretz Yisrael. They didn't keep the Torah in Chutz La'aretz. Maharal says they only kept the positive commandments, not the negative commandments. Different answers. But Rav Chaim Volozhiner suggests the following. Rav Chaim Volozhiner suggests that when the Torah did not exist in a mandatory level, then although it was the ideal way of life, it was possible for individuals to improvise when they determined that this was not the optimal spiritual path. So, for example, there's a law in the Torah that you're not supposed to marry two sisters, but Yaakov intuited that if it's Rachel and Leah, there was a higher spiritual purpose in doing so, that the spiritual world would be enhanced by the violation of that halacha. So he was able to determine that under such a situation, the Torah didn't have to be kept. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner says that type of judgment could only exist before the Torah became mandatory. Once the Torah was given as a command, it no longer had the flexibility to be discarded for unusual circumstances. Again, Rav Chaim doesn't mention it, but obviously he is really addressing a certain theme of Hasidic thought, in which early Hasidus sometimes taught that if you could achieve a higher spiritual goal by, let's say, not saying Shema on time, right? Let's assume Zaman Kriya Shema, the end of the Shema of the morning is 9 o'clock in the morning, or now it's around 8:25 in the morning. And you're still very tired at 8:25. And you could say, so I'll get up at 7:30 and daven. It's going to be superficial. I'm not going to express my love of God. I tell you what, if I sleep until 10, I will have so much kavanah. Isn't that more important? Isn't the subjective religious experience more important than complying with a technical rule? Well, early Hasidus sometimes said that. Rav Chaim Volozhiner says, no, God says what you got to do, and your individual judgment as to what is best doesn't count. But says Rav Chaim, before the Torah was given, that's exactly how the Avos functioned. They functioned on a certain subjective level in which the Torah was the norm, but they could make accommodations and exceptions if, on their understanding, a higher spiritual purpose would be achieved. That's a very amazing thought, actually. And what is a little uncertain is Rav Chaim suggesting the following idea. Is Rav Chaim suggesting that in point of fact, it may still be the case that sometimes violating the Torah might achieve a higher spiritual goal, but we are not inspired and understanding enough to be able to make that judgment. So the Torah operates based on the law of averages, that for most people, most of the time, this is the way it has to be. Maybe for you, it didn't have to be that way, but you're not in a position to make that judgment. That's a pretty amazing thing, because Rav Chaim might be suggesting, and maybe I shouldn't say this when I'm being recorded, Rav Chaim might be suggesting that in a purely objective way, there may be people, there may be situations who they would be better served by a system that's a little different. But Hashem says only the Avos could make judgments like that. And if you're not the Avos, you can't make that judgment. Because we make judgments based on biases, we make judgments based on taiva, we make judgments based on yetzer hara. So our judgments that the Torah doesn't apply to me is always going to be off. But, Rav Chaim is suggesting, the theoretical possibility may in fact exist. In other words, it's a theoretical possibility that no one is allowed to do. Now that's a very different perspective than saying the Torah is an absolutely perfect fit for everybody. Rav Chaim might be intimating it's not always a perfect fit, but it's the best that is possible in a world where we don't have the closeness to Hashem to be able to determine our custom-made relationship with Hashem. Now maybe I'm reading too much of the Nefesh HaChaim, but I think Nefesh HaChaim might be saying something which is actually a surprisingly daring statement. Yeah?
The Gemara in Levi says that as a knas, if for the Levim, it didn't come at the beginning of the first Gula.
Yeah.
That the concept that the maisa rishon goes exclusively to the Kohanim, does that kind of still apply this man there? Can I be mekabel maisa rishon?
Yeah. So this is just to familiarize people with the sugya. We know that the Torah says that when you separate truma, you give the truma to a Cohen, and the maser rishon, the 10% of the crop, you give to the Levi, and d'oraisa, you could give it to a Cohen as well, because d'oraisa, a Cohen is a Levi, but you can give it to a Levi that's not a Cohen. Now, when the Jews returned to Eretz Yisrael, after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, first under Zerubbabel, right, that's in Mos Sur, we talk about Kates Bavel, Zerubbabel. Right, some reason kids like to laugh at that. The alliteration is cute. But Zerubbabel was the first governor of the Jewish community when we returned from Bavel, and only a small group of Jews came, 40,000 altogether, and it's estimated that's around between 1 and 10% of the population of the Jewish people. And then Ezra came a little later, after the Beis HaMikdash was built, and in both there were very, very few Levim. There were more Kohanim than Levim, which is strange because there's supposed to be more Levim than Kohanim. And because of this, the Gemara says Ezra made a kanas. Ezra wanted to punish the tribe of Levi by providing that instead of giving the maser rishon to a Levi, you give a maser rishon to the Cohen. Now, Kohanim were not so great in showing up either, but proportionally, more Kohanim did come than Levim. Now, again, Ezra is not violating the Torah because d'oraisa, a Cohen, is also a Levi. So it's okay, but he did make a gezerah or a takana not to give it to a Cohen. Not to give maser rishon to a Levi because of a kanas. So the question that was raised is that if you're a Levi, does that apply even today? I mean, you're right, and must I give my maser rishon only to a Kohen, or can I give my maser rishon to a Levi? So first, I think I want to step back a little bit and say, do you give maser rishon to anybody? Because again, if any of you have experience in separating trumos and masros, you will know that for the most part we separate things and we don't give them to anybody. We wrap them up in plastic and throw them away. So let me explain a little background about that. How does nesina work today? Hafrasha, you do have to separate. Otherwise it's tevel. And if you get something under hashkafa, they already did it for you. But if you did it yourself, now Shemitah, by the way, there is no trumas and masros. So this year you don't have a worry about it, but otherwise you would. So let's go over each item. Truma today, a Cohen is not allowed to eat because truma cannot be eaten in a state of tuma. And everybody is in a state of tuma today because if we've ever been in a cemetery, we're tameh until we're purified with the ashes of the paradum, which we don't have. So as a result, there's no way a Cohen can eat truma. But that doesn't end the question. Okay, a Cohen can't eat truma. But so what? The halacha is a Cohen can use tameh truma, or if he's tameh, he can use it to feed to his animal or the like. So just because the Cohen cannot eat it, actually there are two reasons the Cohen can't eat it. A Cohen can't eat it because he's tameh, and a Cohen can't eat it because it's tameh. Either way. But that's not an exemption in Nesina. So why don't we give truma to a Cohen? So the truth of the matter is, the main reason we don't give truma to a Cohen today is that Cohen is not able to prove his yichud as a Cohen beyond a doubt. Because every Cohen today is really a suffix Cohen, and as a result, hamotzi mechavero alav haraya, I'm not obligated to give truma to somebody who cannot prove he's definitively a Cohen. Now, let's talk about maser rishon. Maser rishon being tameh, or the Levi being tameh, is actually not a problem, because a Levi can eat maser rishon betuma. And by that I mean a Levi can eat maser rishon that is tameh, and a Levi can eat maser rishon if he's tameh. So the only reason why there may be a svara that I don't have to give maser rishon to a Levi is because of the same idea, hamotzi michavero alav haraya. Of course, there's another issue as well, meaning if someone is claiming he's a Levi, and therefore he wants my maser rishon, I can say, you cannot prove you're a Levi, and therefore I'm not mechuyev to give it to you. Now, if I want to give it, is there any downside in my wanting to give it to someone that's a Levi? But pashtus, there would be no downside. So the result would be, this is all an introduction to your question, that I would be allowed to give my maser rishon to a Levi, even though I would not be obligated to give it to a Levi, because a Levi can't prove his status. So the question then becomes, if out of the kindness of my heart, I want to give my maser rishon to a Levi, do I have to give it to a Cohen, or can I give it to a Levi? So that's a good question. I see two svaras for that. Svara number one is that once you're giving the maser rishon, you must give the maser rishon in accordance with the takana of Ezra. And if the takana of Ezra is to give it to a Cohen, you'd have to give it to a Cohen. But I'll give you a svara number two. If svara number two says, I don't have to give it to anybody, because hamotzi mechabero lefaraya, at that point you can't possibly tell me the takana of Ezra says it has to go to a Kohen, because I can respond, I don't have to give it to anybody. So in a situation where meikar hadin, you are totally exempt from having to give it, it would appear that you could choose to give it to a Kohen or a Levi. And I believe that that's how we paskin, that if one who is machmir to give maser rishon today is allowed to give it to a Levi, because he has the option of not giving it to anybody, and therefore it's not shaykh to Kanes Ezra in such a situation. Yeah.
It seems like sometimes it's very hard to remember things that I learned in class like 10 minutes before. So what are some tips to improve that?
Yeah. The question is that it's so hard to remember things that we learn. Are there any tips for remembering? I wish I had them. It's a good, this is a big frustration. I remember, I've mentioned this before, that many years ago, I was zocher to talk to Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky for a few hours. Really amazing amount of time that he gave me. And we were talking about different things. And one of the things he mentioned to me is that many people can be learning for many years, even, and they don't get a lot of satisfaction in their learning. And he said the main reason is because they don't remember what they learned. And as a result, they don't have the satisfaction of mastering something. It's not so much covering ground. Some people say, oh, I don't feel satisfied because I didn't learn many blot. Rav Yaakov says that's not it. Even if you only learned 20 blot, but you really knew it well, you would have a great sense of accomplishment. Accomplishment comes from a sense of mastery. Of course, we never master the Torah totally. There's always so many levels that we don't fully understand. But if a person feels, I have a solid knowledge of things, I remember what I learned, that gives a person a lot of satisfaction. And that encourages you to keep on learning because you have a sense of knowing what you've learned. So the standard way in which you kind of keep your retention up is by reviewing a lot. And we sometimes don't like to review. We want to go on to something new. But chazara is really the only key to do it. But the chazara shouldn't just be you read over the same stuff again and again. You have to think of different ways of reviewing. For example, taking notes, making charts, writing up the Gemara in your own words. See, on one hand, people think, oh, isn't it better to kind of know what the Gemara says in the words of the Gemara? The truth is not necessarily. Sometimes when you put it in your own words, it remains more in your heart and the like. So I would say chazara, making notes, doing charts, putting things in your own words. Also, when you learn a complicated sugya, and you have ins and outs and ins and outs and ins and outs, you sometimes have to sit back and ask yourself, what do I take away from this? This is a real big problem, because a lot of times you can know every step in a discussion. You can actually follow every step in the discussion, but you still have no idea what the discussion is about. It's like, I know this, and I know this, and I know this, and I know this. What do I know from this sugya? What knowledge do I take out? You understand what I'm saying? In other words, you ask yourself generally, what is it that I know, and what is it that I don't know? What is it that is still confusing? That's very important, because if you leave a sugya in a state of mental fog, I'm just confused, you're not going to remember anything. But if you think about what exactly is it that I don't know, that'll help you a lot, because then you can say, I do know a lot of things here. I know 10 things from this sugya, and there are 5 things I don't know. Okay, 5 things I don't know. I'll find it out eventually. You see the difference? There's a big difference between being confused and being able to pinpoint what it is that you don't know. When you pinpoint what it is you don't know, you can go on. In fact, when you're learning, you don't have to answer every question. You can leave a sugya with a lot of questions, but you can't leave the sugya till you know what your questions are. When you know what it is you don't know, put it in a notebook. You can say, things I don't understand. Keep it in a notebook, and then go weiter, then go on. And you'll find as you learn more and more, some of those questions are going to be answered by themselves. Sometimes the question will be asked by the Gemara, 2 blot ahead, whatever it would be. But my point is, don't leave in a state of general befuddlement. Let your befuddlement be as specific as it can be. Because when you pinpoint it, you can then say, okay, I got 10 things from this Gemara, even though there's a lot of stuff I don't understand. Okay, and then you'll remember it better. You'll remember it better. And I would tell you too that concentrate on the forest and not only the trees. Try to understand the general idea here. When I was, I'm not saying it's transferable necessarily, but when I taught law school, so I don't know if you've ever seen a legal casebook, whatever it is, if you've ever seen a law book. So the thing about law books is they have very, very detailed table of contents. They kind of break everything into headings and subheadings and subheadings and subheadings. Now it's only a table of contents. It doesn't really give you all the stuff. But people would sometimes ask me, what's a good advice to study for a test? And I told them, study the table of contents. Because you got to get structure. You got to get where things are moving. When you have structure, when you have a map, then details fit. You know where the details go. The details come. Same thing with halacha. You learn Mishnah Brura, or any sefer halacha really, and there's like hundreds of rules. Now, it depends on the person's mind, but many people have difficulty. How do you remember 100 rules? But if you understand that the 100 rules actually come, let's say, from 5 or 10 principles, and once you know the principle, then the rule will simply come from the principle. Then you don't have to memorize 100 things anymore. You only have to memorize or understand 5 things. So part of learning is to try to see the general rules that come, and don't necessarily think at this point that you're going to be able to memorize every one of the details. Okay, I don't know if it helps, but that's something to think about. Yeah.
So I have a question regarding Kol Isha.
Yeah.
So back when the Zera was made, like they had like singing was more like unidimensional. Like there was a type of like something clearly recognizable as singing, and it was prohibited because it was like arousing or whatever. Nowadays, with certain styles, let's say if a woman is rapping, or even more extreme, if like a woman is like shouting like in punk music, or growling or screaming in metal, or like something that's clearly like this is not an arousing thing.
Yeah.
Does that still fall under Kol Isha? And as a quick aside, I recently heard that Kol Isha only applies when it's a one-on-one encounter, so like a concert would be excluded. Is that
Right.
true?
So let me talk about Kol Isha a little bit to give people some background. First, what you just said there reminds me when I was engaged to my present wife. So we were in a restaurant in New York, and there was a Japanese woman that started singing. And there was a mashgiach, a Haredi guy, a frum guy. So I went over to the guy and said, this is supposed to be a frum restaurant, a glad kosher restaurant. Like, what's going on? So, Kol Isha. So he said, in Yiddish, he says to me, Nish kan kol, nish kan isha, meaning no voice, no woman. He said, it doesn't count. There's no Kol Isha b'chlal. But okay, now, first of all, let me point out a very interesting thing. There are two different halachas about Kol Isha. One is in Orach Chaim, and one is in Even HaEzer. Two different laws. Law number one about Kol Isha is that in the presence of a woman singing, now I know that you asked, that's the definition of that, but in the presence of a woman singing, you are not allowed to say Shema, to say brachos, or to learn Torah. And that Isser is very strong. That's even if it's your own wife or your own daughter, in which there's no Isser to hear her voice. There's an Isser in Hilchos Kriya Shema and Tefillah and brachos and Talmud Torah that you're not allowed to learn in the presence of a woman's singing voice. That is halacha number one of Kol Isha. Now, according to some rishonim, which we don't paskin like, but be aware of it, that's the only halacha of Kol Isha. According to those rishonim, if you're not learning, saying brachos or davening, I could go, to a rock concert and listen to a woman sing. Now, we don't paskin that. We do not paskin that way. Be sure you underscore that. Because we have another halacha in Even HaEzer, which basically says it is forbidden to listen to the singing of a woman's voice because it's sexually arousing. But that law has a number of exceptions. I can listen to my wife singing, etc. I can listen to my daughter, machlokas by sister. Okay, I don't want to go into all the details at that point. So be sure you understand that there are two different halachas of Kol Isha. One is a halacha that pertains to Kriya Shema, Tefillah, Talmud Torah, and brachos. And the other pertains to the general Isser of listening to a woman singing because it is improperly sexually arousing. By the way, the problem of the first Kol Isha could really be very amazing. Am I allowed to sing Zemiros with my wife? Just my wife. Now, I don't have an issue to hear my wife sing. That's permitted. But if Zemiros are Divrei Torah or Tefillah, then how am I allowed to do it? So Rabbi Yashav actually said, Rabbi Yashav was very strict. He said, if your wife really wants to sing Zemiros, you have to let her sing solo, and you can learn without moving your lips. Meaning, the Yisra of Talmud Torah in front of a Kol Isha is only bedibur, not behirur. So you can have your Gemara there, you could think in learning, and let your wife sing solo. That's a pretty strict position. Most poskim say, huh?
So the Aisha thing marked it for groups.
No, I'll get to that. That's a separate issue. I'm just talking about one woman.
Neither or not, it's the same thing.
So that's another machlokas. But many poskim say that even ishto nida, you can listen to your wife sing. Now, most poskim say Zemiros is not a problem because Zemiros is not considered within the category of brachos, tefillah, or divrei Torah. It's more generic, and it would be mutter. Okay, that's Lagabi Zemiros. Now, the Isra of Kol Isha, both types. So the question becomes, number one, is different types of shouting or chanting. Remember, a woman's spoken voice, STAM, a woman's giving a speech, we paskin at least that's not Kol Isha. There has to be a musical sound. So the question is, what is a musical sound? So the truth is, there's a tshuva from Rav Yaakov Emden, that Rav Yaakov Emden apparently was talking about the fact that when people like sailors or something, when they would be schlepping a boat, they'd be dragging, the way they used to have boats, and they would pull with ropes, and they would, I don't know exactly why women were pulling the boat, but they'd be pulling the boat, and they would have some type of chant to kind of kill time while they were doing it. And Rav Yaakov Emden says, that's not musical and the like. So there is such a svara in the tshuvos that some things are not singing. Certainly shouting is not music. Rap may not be music. And indeed, I have actually seen religious organizations, although I can't bring a proof from them, that have employed female rapping so to speak, in mixed groups, claiming whatever. Okay. So all I'm saying is that your point is a good point, but it's hard to apply lamaisa, so it's better to avoid anything that has kind of a musical, rhythmic quality. Pure shouting, ein chanami, would be mutter. I mean, assuming you're allowed to be in a place that's doing that type of music. That's a separate issue. There's other issues. There's sneas. There's all sorts of things going on. Now, the issue of, there are other issues of Kol Isha. One is the issue of multiple singing and mixed voices. Let's assume that you have more than one woman singing, or let's assume you have men and women singing. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah and Megillah talks about the idea of trei kole lo mishtami, that when two voices are going on, you're not really focused on any one of the voices. And some have used that as a heter of Kol Isha in a group, both in terms of zemiros and benching, and in terms of being able to listen. So choral music would be permitted. Now, this position is commonly stated in the name of the Seridei Eish. Seridei Eish was a very, very interesting gadol. He died in the late 1960s. Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who was very unusual. He was on one hand a very close Talmud of the Alter of Slobodka, but he also was educated in universities, and he spent part of his life in Germany. Then he was in the Warsaw Ghetto. At the end of the war, he went to Switzerland, and he died in Switzerland. He was considered to be a very, very great posek, but he was very lenient on a lot of issues, and in particular, it's important to point out that the leniency of the Seridei Eish of Trei Kole Lo Mishtame was dealing with a very specific situation. I want to show you how people abuse the Seridei Eish heter. He was dealing, when he came to Germany from Lita, he was really encountering a totally different world. The Litvischer world that he came from were people that were learning Yom and V'layla. There was no secular education. There was no mixing of boys and girls. He comes to Germany, and like everything is different. Everyone's going to college, and this and that. And at first, he writes, at first he couldn't be civil this. All he saw was how this was a place without religious standards. But then he understood that for this generation, this was something very good. So one of the things that he encountered in Germany that he had not seen in Lithuania was a group that was called Ezra. Now, Ezra was mamish like NCSY today. NCSY, if anyone is familiar with NCSY. So you have boys and girls together, and they sing together, and they do all sorts of stuff together. They try at least to keep no negiah, whatever it is. But Kol Isha for sure goes out the window. The boys and the girls are singing and the like. And that's what this group was doing. And Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg mattered the mixed singing because of Trei Kole Lo Mishtame. But it was very clear that the reason for his heter was that this was an important stepping stone in bringing Jewish teenagers to mitzvos and to Torah and to Avoda Hashem. And if you were to simply tell the girls they couldn't sing, they might not show up at all, and whatever it would be. So this is a getter almost of a hiras shah, of an emergency to be makarev people, which did have a halachic basis, but it wasn't necessarily something to be translatable as a general rule. Now, I admit, the Seridei Eish heter would apply 100% to NCSY. NCSY is dealing with almost the same situation as the Seridei Eish. But I'll give you an example of how it was abused. There was a modern Orthodox school that I was very involved in, and the principal was a progressive principal. I'm not presently involved with the school anymore. And he wanted to put on he wanted the high school to put on a Les Miserables, the play, a Broadway play, which involves a lot of musical singing and the like. And he wanted to say that we can allow the girls to sing as long as some boy is humming along as well, based on Trei Kole Lo Mishtame. Now, Les Miserables was not a Kiruv event. It was not necessarily calculated to bring people to a heightened awareness of Torah and mitzvahs. So to use the Seridei Eish for those types of recreational events is really not proper. But as I say, it certainly can be used for benching. It can be used for zemiros, and certainly for Balei Tshuva, or people who are not yet from. It can be used as a way of allowing them to participate in a way that makes them feel closer to Hashem. There are also other shilos with Kol Isha. Does it apply to recorded music? Is there a difference between audio and video? Right? These are all chilukim, and there are positions that are mekel on all of these things, and there are positions that are machmer on all of these things. Now, the final point is, it is reported mipi hashmua, and here you're going to have to figure out how this works. This is, I don't know if there's any definitive evidence of this, that Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who was the Rav in Frankfurt, used to attend opera. Now, it's extremely, now again, I can't say I know that this is true, but this is what is reported. Now, this is extremely difficult to understand what the heter is. Number one, opera is live music, not recorded. Okay, you're sitting in an opera. Number two, women were soloists, not just as part of a chorus. So what type of heter do you have for a solo woman singing in a live performance without a chorus? There seems to be zero heter for that. The only possible heter, and I would be very surprised, is because it's connected to Shulchan Aruch, is that Rav Hirsch came to the maskana that the Isser of Kol Isha is only for brachos, Kriya Shema, Tefillah, and Torah, and there is no Isser of Kol Isha when you're not doing one of those things. Now, are there rishonim that say that? Yes, there are. There are rishonim that say that. There are rishonim that say that the whole sugya of Kol Isha only applies to brachos, tefillah, and Talmud Torah. There are such shitas. But the Shulchan Aruch in Even Oezer and the Ramah reject that shita. So to me it would be extremely schwer, extremely difficult to simply say, I go like the Rishonim that are cholek on the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. But that's the only possible heter I could imagine, because going to an opera is the paradigm of Kol Isha. You know, there are heterim for recorded music, and there are heterim for mixed choirs, and there may even be heterim for two women singing. But a soloist in a live performance, Bichlal, has no heter at all. So again, I don't want to say Rav Hirsch did it, but I've seen it reported. By the way, another thing Rav Hirsch did, which indeed is reported, and this is fascinating, is that, you know, he established in Frankfurt, he established an educational system from elementary school all the way to yeshiva, Gedola, right? He established it. People know of Rav Hirsch today as a great writer, but he was a tremendous community builder. He was a tremendously gifted organizer and builder of community and the like. But it is said that in secular studies, they divided the day between Limudei Kodesh and Limudei Chol, that the boys didn't wear kippos, they didn't wear yarmulkes in the yeshiva during the hours of secular study. That Rav Hirsch held that there was not a chiyuv to wear a yarmulke all the time. Now, this is absolutely unthinkable today, but in Germany that was the hanhaga, that even very frum people did not wear a kippah when they were not learning or making a bracha or the like. That I think is documented that way. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Going against the Taz, it says it's going not to wear a kippah.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that Germany had its own minhagim, meaning to say, remember that the Kehila of Yidden in Ashkenaz, although Rav Hirsch was a newcomer, so to speak, because he created his Kehila in the 1850s, but when he created the Kehila of Frankfurt, he was going back to many old German minhagim. And, you know, the Taz was Polish, and the German minhagim had different drachim. So many of these things were taloi on minhagim. Yeah. Yeah,
Is it consistent with the Jewish Hashkafa to support the death penalty in secular courts?
Okay, so that's a totally different question. Is it consistent with Jewish Hashkafa to support the death penalty in secular courts? So, in other words, should I be in favor of the state of New York or the state of California imposing death penalties on murderers or the like? So here is the interesting thing. On one hand, we know that the Torah itself does create death penalties for many, many offenses. But at the same time, we also know that the rules of evidence were so amazingly difficult that the Sanhedrin almost never killed anybody. Right? The Mishnah in Mako says, if the Sanhedrin killed somebody once every 7 years, and according to one opinion, once every 70 years, they were called a bloody court. The guy always got off. I mean, Hashem, you never get off with Hashem, but in terms of the court, they got off. And Rabbi Akiva even said, and if I would have been on the Sanhedrin, nobody would ever get killed. I'd always find a way out. So, B'pashtus, if you look at just the halachic system has the death penalty as kind of a warning of how bad the sin is, but it's not really meant to be applied. So you would think, therefore, I should not be an advocate for capital punishment in the secular system. But the counter-argument is that the secular system of Goyim, put aside Eretz Yisrael for a moment, is not based on the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. It is based on the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. And under the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, you don't need all of the procedural requirements of a Jewish Sanhedrin. You don't need warning. You don't need to warn the guy. You don't need two witnesses. Circumstantial evidence is enough. And since murder is certainly one of the Noachide commandments, and the punishment for violating the Noachide commandment is, in fact, the death penalty, so I ought to be in favor of the death penalty because I am supporting the state following the Noachide laws, which it has an obligation to do, following the 7 commandments of Noah. So as a result, there are a number of poskim that have said that we should be in favor of capital punishment in a secular system, because generally speaking, the capital punishment is only going to be imposed for crimes that are punishable by capital punishment under the Noachide law. I mean, it's unthinkable. I mean, first of all, even theft is punishable by capital punishment, even though we're not going that far. So what was interesting is Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, Zechrono Livracha, he was the younger brother of Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik was a great, he was Rav Chaim Brisker's grandson. And he was a great, great, great Talmid Chacham, also a very, very sweet, sweet man. I remember when I lived in Chicago, we used to see Rav Aaron go shopping with his Rebbitzin all the time. Like he would let you go into the store and go shopping, and he'd have a cart. Just a very, very brilliant person, a great, great Talmid Chacham, a great gadol, but a very simple person in that way, very unpretentious person. But Rav Aaron Soloveitchik actually testified when the state of Illinois was debating whether they should have capital punishment. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik testified against it. He said he was not in favor of capital punishment, and Jewish law would not support it. So a lot of Rabbanim questioned Rav Aaron Soloveitchik. They said, what are you talking about? Under the Noachide laws, a Noachide court, meaning a non-Jewish court, is supposed to execute people who murder and the like, and you don't need to aid him, and you don't need warning. So the procedures of a secular court to administer capital punishment is perfectly consistent with the Noachide code. So how could you say that you were against a secular court following the 7 commandments of Noach? That's good kasha. So Rav Aaron gave 2 answers to this. First of all, he said, the rule that a Noachide court is supposed to impose capital punishment for violations of the Noachide code presupposes a fair and impartial justice system. So here he's being a little political. And he said, given the state of juries and courts in the United States, which again, there's a lot of evidence that capital punishment is disproportionately imposed on minorities, and there's racial discrimination and the like. Rav Aaron felt, you could argue with this, but Rav Aaron felt that courts and juries were not fair, they were not objective, they were biased, they were accepting evidence. Now you don't need to aid them, but you still need reliable evidence, and the evidence they were accepting was not really reliable evidence. So he felt that tainted the procedure, and b'chiyai gavna, even a secular court should not impose capital punishment. That was reason number 1. Reason number 2 is a chiddush of Rav Aaron himself, and I've actually mentioned this chiddush before. Rav Aaron says, and there's a makar for this in some other earlier achronim, that when the Gemara tells us violations of the Noachide code can be punishable by capital punishment, it isn't saying they must impose capital punishment. Rather, the Torah is giving them the latitude to impose whatever punishment they want, even capital punishment. But, Rav Aaron said, A civilized society is normally not going to do that, except for the most extreme cases. And if a court or a society decides that the punishment should be imprisonment or something else, they are not violating the Noahide Code, because the Noahide Code never compelled. This is a chiddush. You would not get this impression from the Gemara. But he learns, when the Gemara says, Asarasan zui misasan, that the Noahide prohibition carries capital punishment, that is a maximum punishment. That is not a required punishment. And therefore, we're entitled to basically say a civilized society should err on the side of life. So those were his two reasons. But as I say, many Rabbanim do go with the position of your question, that the Noahide law says capital punishment, so non-Jewish court should impose it. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, it's a very different situation. In Eretz Yisrael, a Jewish state, so a Jewish state, b'pashtus, needs to be governed by Torah law, and what that would mean is, under Torah law, for a Jewish Beis Din to impose capital punishment, you need edim, you need witnesses, you need warning, at least vis-a-vis a Jewish defendant. So as a result, it would be very, very questionable if the state of Israel would be allowed to impose capital punishment on a Jewish person, unless all of the requirements of halacha were met, and even then, you don't have a Sanhedrin that has smicha. So they're not able to do it. So you'd have to differentiate between a Jewish state and a non-Jewish state. Yeah.
The Rabbi mentioned before about like only the Avot can kind of have like a subjective.
Yeah.
How is the Ribnitzer Rabbi able to like already create some time?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. It's a bit of a painful question, and that is, I mean, he's one example, but the question basically was that there were great Hasidic rabbis. There still are some great Hasidic rabbis that seem to break the rules. They daven Shachris, Mincha time, and Mincha Ma'ariv time, and they end Shabbos 3 days later. And the question becomes, like, what's going on? And all I can say is that I have less of a problem with the Rebbe than with the followers. I can believe that there may be unusual tzaddikim that kind of, I mean, some will say this is apikoros, and maybe Rav Chaim Volozhiner wouldn't agree, but there may be an idea that they have a private relationship with God. I mean, the Torah is like for everybody, and they have they have their unique relationship, and who knows what's going on. But I don't see any possible justification for the STAM followers to kind of imitate the Rebbe. I mean, there are some things, I mean, Lubavitcher Rebbe used to say this generally. I mean, he would say, some things are for a Rebbe to do, and they're not meant to be imitated by other people. These are private hanhagos. And the problem is when you have like regular people doing these extraordinary things about breaking away from the limits of halacha, then almost by definition they're doing something wrong. The Rebbe himself, who knows? People can have their private arrangements. Yeah.
Okay, so assuming that all restrictions of yichud and shomer negiah between staff members are being followed, is a single person who's somebody's not married allowed to work on a Kiruv trip with mixed gender interaction and activities?
Yeah, so that's a very, very difficult question. Assuming that the halachos of yichud and negiah, sexual touching, are being observed, is a single person allowed to work for Kiruv purposes with a mixed group of boys and girls or teenagers, college students, whatever the age is it allowed or is it not allowed? So here I would suggest that I would not phrase the question in terms of allowed or not allowed, because it's not a one-size-fit-all answer. And that is assuming, and this is very important, assuming you're keeping the halachos. That's step number one. Got to keep yichud, got to keep negiah. If you're not doing that, then can't do it. That's for sure. But assuming you're keeping the halachas, the question then becomes, what is the effect on you? And that's a very subjective thing. If you find yourself getting aroused, if you find yourself, excuse my language for being explicit, fantasizing and thinking about the women and imagining different things, then it's something that is dragging you down. It's something that is affecting your kedusha. You need to get out of it. And by the way, that could even happen for a married person as well. I mean, if it's affecting you in that way, it's not for you. If, on the other hand, you can honestly say that I'm kind of objective, I'm doing my job, and I'm not distracted, then I'm not going to say it's usher. I mean, think about this. I mean, you have men teachers in seminaries. Now, granted, in some ways, a seminary may not be as bad as what you're describing, because a seminary, at least the girls are dressed sanias. In the group you're talking about, you're confronting those problems. But still, a man teaches in seminary. It could be a very, very similar problem in some ways. So a lot of these halachos depend very much on how it is affecting you. Meaning to say, there is both an objective component, red lines that you cannot cross, like yichud and negiah. Those are objective. They apply to everybody. And then there are subjective components of how does something affect you as a person. And that depends on your libido, and that depends on your imagination, that depends on all sorts of many, many different things, and it may not be the proper thing. And by the way, this can come up in a lot of contexts that are seemingly innocuous, but they could be more dangerous than you might think. Let's imagine, for example, you have 25-year-old rabbi, just got married a year ago. He would like to invite his 17-year-old seminary students to his house for Shabbos. What's wrong? Not so pashut. And in fact, I can't prove things by anecdotes, but there are stories out there of marriages getting broken up because of this type of behavior. And in fact, I don't want to talk about the incident that everybody's talking about. I've talked a lot about it already, but that's how all of these things start. The rabbis that cross boundaries and get involved in sexual abuse, they didn't enter the rabbinate so they could become predators. They don't say, I got my smicha, now I can go and molest children and women. No, that's not how it works. This was all l'shem shamayim originally. But, you cross the boundaries a little bit. And you say, okay, maybe there's yichud, but I'm doing it to help somebody. The woman is so distraught, why can't I hold her hand and give her a little comfort? Meaning, they're doing it for good reasons. But you cross the boundaries. You get yourself in a position of a point of no return. And then it turns into what it turns into. Right? The Torah is a very wise system. Hashem doesn't need me to say that. And when the Torah has all of these rules and all of these boundaries, it's not because yichud with a woman is such a bad thing. Yichud with a woman is not a bad thing. Nothing is getting right. But once the boundaries are dissolved, it will lead to bad things at the end. And therefore, it's better to kind of avoid the situations. So my answer to you is it very much depends on how it affects a person. And different people are affected in different ways. Yeah.
The iconic way that Muslims pray with going their head all the way to the ground. I've
Yeah.
heard two stories, I don't know which is true, and both of them say that this came from Judaism originally, saying that Muhammad saw this during Yom Kippur, and that's why they do it 5 times a day instead of 3. And I've also heard someone else tell me that he's like a Yemenite from some community, and it's not like the general Yemenite, but different, where they said, oh no, Jews used to pray like this all the time, like when you go Baruch Hashem, you'd go all the way down instead of just, and he was telling me, I don't know if this is true, but he was trying to tell me that the Rambam's son was complaining about chairs being brought into a synagogue or something, and how synagogues used to not have chairs. Is this true, or what is the truth about this, and what?
Yeah. The issue is the way the Muslims bow when they pray. Right, they get on their knees and they have sometimes a full body prostration and the like. First of all, Muhammad's relationship with the Jewish people is actually very, very interesting. Muhammad actually wanted to convert. He was kind of an illiterate camel driver, and he worked for Jewish people, and he liked what he saw in Judaism, and he wanted to convert, but he wasn't considered to be ready or worthy of converting, whatever the reason was, so he started his own thing. But Muhammad had an imagination. He loved midrashim. He loved stories, so he made up his own stories afterwards, but and the like. So there's going to be a lot of commonality between Judaism and Islam, because Muhammad had a lot of exposure to Jews in his early years, in his 20s. and the like. Now, the notion of body prostration was absolutely a feature of Jewish worship. In the Beis HaMikdash, every time, not just on Yom Kippur, people think it's only Yom Kippur, not true. Every time the Shem Hashem was mentioned in the Beis HaMikdash, which was always Shem Havaya, people did a full body prostration and the like. Now, there is a problem. The Torah does say that we're not allowed to do a full body prostration on a stone floor because it resembles idolatry. That's why you need on Yom Kippur, you need a rug, or you need a talis, or you need something. But Tachanan, the original form of Tachanan wasn't just, this. Tachanan was, I bow with my head to the ground. That is what Tachanan was originally. So it got into misuse in some ways, because on one hand, since other religions adopted it, we don't want to do things that other religions are doing, even though they got it from us. But I remember reading, and I'm trying to look this up because it's a vague memory in my head, and I wish I could find the documentation, that Rabbi Avigdor Miller actually said. He talked about a few private things a person should do. I remember, and again, I wish I could find it, that he said that once a day in the privacy of your home, you should do a full body prostration to Hashem with the appropriate hefsek between you and the stone floor, like a garment or a robe, to give yourself a sense of reverence for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That he says we don't do it publicly anymore, we don't do it in shul, we don't do it, but this in fact was an authentic way of worship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it certainly had its place. Another example is that the authentic Jewish way of prayer was to raise your hands to Shemayim. Raise your hands up. Today we tend not to do that too much. Some people do a little hand raise, but the notion of literally doing that. So there were modalities of worship that were characteristic of Jewish worship that kind of got stolen from us, and we don't want to look like we're imitating them.
It's from that idea that we don't want to look like the Muslims.
Yeah.
Wouldn't, but by contrast, shouldn't Ashkenazim want to do it as not look like Christians? Since they're from Europe.
Well, okay, I understand. Like, either way, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be imitating somebody. But I think it was thought that since the bowing, it's not just a question of I don't want to, in other words, since bowing was associated with those other religions, so there's a maris ayin that it looks like you're practicing that other religion. Now, the 5 times a day also, right? The fact that Muslims pray 5 times a day is, our Yom Kippur prayer is 5 times a day. And by the way, that's why the Mefarshim say that the Golus of Yishmael, the ascendancy of the Arabs before Mashiach comes, is the most dangerous Golus for Am Yisrael. Because unlike the other enemies that only have physical might, Bnei Yishmael have spiritual power. And spiritual power can only be defeated by spiritual means. Their spiritual power is circumcision. Their spiritual power is modesty, sexual modesty, tznius. Their spiritual power is prayer. That they pray every day the number of times we only pray on Yom Kippur. And that's why they are such a dangerous enemy, because they bring to the table a spiritual power. In fact, it was an amazing thing. I remember reading a few years ago when Jordan was allowing Israelis to visit Jordan. There was some talk that they wanted to not let teenagers come in because Israeli teenagers were not dressing in accordance with the proper standards of modesty that the kingdom of Jordan wanted to preserve. What a chilul Hashem. I mean, the chilul Hashem is that the Goyim say, we don't want to let Jews in because they're not tznius enough. But that was the case. And those are zechuyos, in spite of the fact that so many of the Arab nations or Arabs are murderers and everything else, and they do all sorts of bad things. They have certain spiritual strengths that give them ezechus. By the way, the Meshech Chochmah says a fascinating thing. The Meshech Chochmah says that we know, Chazal teach us, that Yishmael did tshuva towards the end of his life. Yishmael did tshuva. So the Meshech Chochmah says that also means the Bnei Yishmael, the followers of Islam that are descended from Yishmael, are also going to do tshuva, bi'acharis hayamim. And the first stage in the tshuva of Bnei Yishmael was conversion to Islam. In other words, the monotheism of Islam replaced the paganism of the Arab world. And that was a step towards tshuva. And some want to say the second stage in Islamic tshuva is what is called the Abrahamic Accords. That's where you have Dubai and United Arab Emirates opening up relations with Israel and even having shows. I think there are 2 Chabad houses in Dubai, I think. It's like the old joke about the desert islands, right? And there are 2 shows on the desert islands, and the one Jew says, that's the shul I used to daven in. I mean, how many Jews are in Dubai that you need two Chabad houses? But there are. And that's also a stage in Tshuva, in which the Bnei Yishmael is coming closer to the Jewish people. Yeah.
You see so many different, a lot of times even like bizarre, Aggadic stories in the Gemara. How do we know like how to navigate which ones to take literally, which not to take literally, and if there is any, I guess, theory and understanding like different Aggadic statements and like that?
Yeah, the question was that we have so many statements in the Agada of the Gemara and in Midrashim that seem to be very, very difficult to believe. How do we know when to take something literally and when is something symbolic? So actually, next week, when we go back to our Torah Shabbat Peh, that's the next thing the Rambam is going to talk about in the introduction. The Rambam writes the following. I'll give you a little preview of it. The Rambam writes that there are 3 schools of thought about Aggadata. One says Aggadata is literal, and as a result, it's Baba Maisas, meaning they disparage Aggadata. They say, oh, Chazal are saying making literal statements. The literal statements are ridiculous. So Chazal were either foolish or liars. That's position number 1. Position number 2 is the other way. Aggadata is literal, and Chazal are right. If Moshe Rabbeinu is said to be 20 amos high, and he could only reach Og Melech HaBashan's ankle, then that's what it was. Moshe is 40 feet high, and Og Melech HaBashan is whatever, 300 feet high. Now, the Rambam says, both positions have a common denominator, that Aggadata is literal, but one group says it's therefore false, and the other group says it's therefore true. So the Rambam says the first group are apikorsim, and the second group are idiots. The Rambam says it is wrong to pose the question, is Aggada true or false? That is a false binary question. Aggada is certainly true, but the truth of Aggadata is not always meant to be a literal truth. It is meant to express symbolic, spiritual ideas with metaphors and analogies. This is a very important yesod. Instead of asking, is it true or not true, you have to say it's always true. But what is the truth? Is the truth the literal, or is the truth the metaphorical and symbolic? And the Rambam says the Chachamim often want to convey the deepest spiritual ideas through far-fetched parables, mishalim. But then the Rambam says, on the other hand, there is a core of Aggadata that is quite literal, kind of telling you the history of something. So, how do you know what's literal and what's not? The fact that something's supernatural doesn't mean it's not literal, because, miracles can happen. Miracles did happen. So here we have a very disappointing answer I'm going to tell you. The Rambam says, Be'ezras Hashem, I am going to write a book that will go through all of the Aggadata in Shas, and I will tell you what is meant to be literal and what is meant to be symbolic and what the symbolic meaning is. What a great book that would be, right? Unfortunately, we have no such book. Either the Rambam didn't get around to writing it, he was so busy with other things, or he wrote it and for some reason it got lost. We don't have it. So the Rambam is telling you that there's a key to it, but we don't have the key. We lost the key. We never had the key. So the truth of the matter is that there are other Meforshim, though, who try to unlock the symbolic meaning of Aggadita. The greatest and the most famous is Maharal of Prague. Basically viewed Aggadita in highly symbolic ways. And if you go through any Aggadita that the Maharal wrote on, and he did write on most of the Aggadic in Shas, the strange omission is that there's no, the Maharal has what are called Chidushay Aggada, ala Shas. He doesn't have it on Maseches Brachos, which is strange. Brachos has almost the most Aggadita of all of Shas. And for some reason, that's the one the Maharal didn't do. Okay. But he did everything else. And you'll see kind of the symbolic language that the Maharal uses. So all I can tell you is, you don't really know, but I can say that if you don't believe that an Aggada is literal, you are not a Kofer or an Apikoros. As long as you believe that there's deep truths in here that are expressed in different ways, so you're not malig, you're not making fun of the Chachamim, you're not denying the greatness of the Chachamim, but you're simply saying their words have to be understood in a symbolic way. That is an absolutely legitimate approach to Aggadita and Midrash. Yeah.
Is it permissible to have coffee or sort of tea during Sukkot Zimra? And is there any kind of particular cutoff during?
Yeah, so the question is, are you allowed to drink coffee, tea, or anything during Pesukei Zimra? So first of all, it's obvious that I'm assuming by your question that you already made the Shahakol, because you wouldn't be allowed to say a bracha during Pesukei Zimra, because that would be an interruption like talking, right? So that's a given. If you didn't have a bracha that's covering you, you would not be allowed to do so. Now, assuming that you made a bracha, let's say, before Korbanos, and you were drinking throughout Korbanos, and you want to continue drinking during Pesukei Zimra, me'ikar adin, it is mutter, because it is only prohibited to have a hefsek in speech, and drinking is not per se a hefsek. Nevertheless, it is brought down that it's generally improper. It's not considered that respectful to Hashem to take drinks in the middle. I mean, imagine you're with the president, and you just, if he gave you a cup of coffee, that's one thing, but you wouldn't just bring your own coffee and start drinking at a meeting with the president. So it's not considered kavadik. So I would say it would depend. If your throat, for example, is very sore, or you have difficulty talking, you need to clear your throat, so then I would say that's okay. That's almost a tzorich tefillah. But generally, one should try to avoid it. Yeah.
So the Gemara and Succah, Lamed Amud Aleph, it says, it brings a story about, I believe, Rabbi Yehuda instructing these sellers of Hadassim to have the owners of the land cut it, the non-Jews cut the thing, because if they cut it themselves, they would be stealing.
Yeah.
And it says that because STAM land is stolen. STAM land owned by non-Jews is stolen.
Yeah.
So how do we today, or how is there the shita of allowing Yuval Nachri? Why is STAM land, even if they say I've owned it for 20 generations, it's still like the STAM land is stolen. It's still.
Yeah. So the question was that the Gemara in Sukkah makes an assumption that most land, or at least some land, in the hands of non-Jews is assumed to be stolen land, and that's why you shouldn't cut your hadassim for sukkahs from the non-Jewish land, because then you would be you'd be stealing, because the land belongs to somebody else. So if that's the case, then how by Shemitah can I rely on what is called the produce right of non-Jewish land? Right, one of the ways we get around Shemitah restrictions is we buy the produce from non-Jewish land. By the way, just a point of just clarification. Do not confuse, and maybe we should talk about the laws of Shemitah at some other point, Yevul Nachri and Heter Mechira. They are very, very close, but they're also very, very different. Yevul Nachri means I buy the produce from land that is owned by a goy. The goy owns the land all the time. Now, Yevul Nachri is also a machlokes, but the minhag of Yerushalayim has been Yevul Nachri does not have any Shemitah restrictions. And this is nothing to do with Dati Liumi. Even the Eidach Haredis, the Badat, takes the position Yevul Nachri does not have the laws of Shemitah attached. This is based on Rav Yosef Karo, and this is said to be the Minhag Yerushalayim. The Chazon Ish happens to be Machmer, and what's happening is that through Rav Chaim Kanevsky, B'nai Brak, Minhagim are permeating Yerushalayim, but the Minhag Yerushalayim has been Yevul Nachri is mutter. Now, Heter Mechira is based on Yevul Nachri, by the Rabbanut selling all the land to a guy, but because it's an institutional pro forma sale, most of the Haredi world does not accept it. But not accepting Heter Mechira as a legitimate abrogation of Shemitah has nothing to do with Yevul Nachri. Yevul Nachri is accepted. Okay, that's important to separate them. Meaning, Heter Mechira depends on Yevul Nachri, but Yevul Nachri does not depend on Heter Mechira. Two different concepts. But your question is, how can I'm sorry.
May I just add one point to
Yeah.
the question? Also, you're not allowed to sell land to non-Jews, so there's
Yeah, that's
even
correct.
less of a way to...
That's correct. There is an Isser D'Oraisa to sell land in Eretz Yisrael to a non-Jew. Although some matir, in fact, that was the Chazon Ish's argument against the Heter Mechira, and Rav Kook responded that only applied to idolaters and pagans. It did not apply to Muslims who were monotheists. I think that's part of the argument there. Okay, but be it as it may, putting aside the Avera, because even if it's an Avera, once it's done, it's done. That's a separate thing. I think the difference would be that once you have a system of courts and a system of laws, then you no longer assume that land is stolen. Meaning the assumption of the Gemara that a guy is typically in possession of stolen land kind of referred to a scenario where there was a certain lawlessness in the community and in which Jews were not protected. So if some guy knocked a Jew off his land and just took it over, like Nazi Germany or something, so nobody would complain and nobody would enforce and nobody would protect, so we have to assume that it was stolen, primarily from other Jews. That's the context there. Mashiach came today, particularly in a Jewish state, although Jews sometimes suffer that as well, even here, but you no longer have the same assumption, meaning the assumption changes based on a legal system that protects people that file complaints. So that would be the difference there. Yeah?
How does one train himself to imagine that Mashiach could come any moment?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned a few days ago, Rav Chaska Levenstein, the great Mashgiach of Panovich, used to say that a good Baal Musar has to have a good imagination. You have to kind of imagine Yitzias Mitzrayim, imagine Matan Torah, imagine Kriyas Yamsuf. Different people have different capacities for this. When you imagine, think about if you ever heard of method acting, like Marlon Brando, different Hollywood actors, they specialize in really imagining what it's like to be in a situation, and then they can genuinely cry or laugh or whatever it would be. But that takes a certain power. That takes a certain powerful imagination. A lot of us don't have that powerful imagination a little bit. So it's not an easy thing to emotionally, even if you believe in Mashiach, I believe in Mashiach 100%, but to emotionally, feel for it. So part of it is like anything else. Practice makes perfect, meaning you start doing it, you start imagining, you start thinking, you start dramatizing. And what happens with the human being generally is, as you habituate yourself in certain behaviors, it becomes more part of you and the like. But you need to, let me add another aspect to this. You need to fill in the picture a little bit. By that I mean that you need to study what life under Mashiach will be like. Because right now, if you just have this general idea, Mashiach will come and we'll have the Beis HaMikdash. Well, what did the Beis HaMikdash look like? What were Korbanos like? What was the Shalosh Regalim when you had millions of Jews coming? In other words, part of what helps you to imagine something is filling in the details of the picture. So it's not just a vague thing, but it really is something that you can picture in your mind. So learning will help you in that too. You learn about Mashiach, you learn about the Beis HaMikdash, you learn about how the Korban Pesach was brought, and then it becomes more real to you, and then you can imagine it in a stronger way. Yeah?
Does the Rav believe that there's 36 hidden tzaddikim that are keeping up the world? And
Yeah.
if so, why would it be 36 and why would they be hidden?
Yeah, the question is, do I believe are there 36 hidden tzaddikim in the world? And what is significant about the number 36? First of all, let me point out that the source of the 36 righteous people is actually a Gemara. But the Gemara does not say they're hidden. The Gemara says at any time there are 36 righteous people who keep the world alive. So the notion that they're hidden is actually not in the Gemara. Not in the Gemara at all. But it is in the Zohar. The Zohar does talk about them as being the hidden tzaddikim. Someone once said that they believed that the Vilna Gaon was one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim. So someone said to him, that's pretty crazy. The Vilna Gaon is certainly a great tzaddik, but we would not call him hidden. I mean, he was known all over the whole Jewish world for his greatness. He says, that's your whole point. He's so great that whatever you know about him is a tiny tip of the iceberg. And therefore, the Vilna Gaon is a hidden tzaddik too, because there's so much more than even what you think you're able to see. And then in Hasidic stories, there's so many stories about the hidden tzaddikim that, they're like janitors in nightclubs. Again, some of them are very, very funny stories. Like people who are playing cards or people in bars. But these are the hidden, these are the real hidden tzaddikim. A lot of stories of Baal Shem Tov with kind of very unusual characters who wind up to be the tzaddikim of the world. But why the number 36? So the Gemara in Chulin has a drasha. It's really a gematria. Yasel machakeloi, that God keeps the world alive for those who are waiting for Him, and the gematria of lo, lamed vav, is 36. So the Gemara derives it from a gematria. What would the svara be? I really don't know. I mean, the one thing about 36 is it's double chai, and that would mean that they bring the generation to God's blessings in life in this world, and brings them to the olam haba. So it could be that's the number of 36. But other than that, I don't have a particular hezber about the number 36. Yeah.
Can the Rabbi explain if there's different ways to fulfill the mitzvah of Shnayim Mikra, especially for people who want to start the mitzvah and they don't necessarily understand the value of Targum?
Yeah. So the mitzvah of Shnayim Mikra v'yachad Targum, that you have to read the pasuk twice and the Aramaic translation once, is a chiyuv b'pashtus from the Gemara itself, and it mentions anyone that keeps the mitzvah of Shnayim Mikra v'yachad Targum is zocheh to arichos yamim, is given a blessing of long life. In fact, some people have pointed out that this is the only chelek of Torah learning that is explicitly mandated by halacha. It's almost as if to say, if you can only do one thing in your learning, some would actually say Shnayim Mikra v'yachad Targum is the one thing that you have to do. Now, the problem is, of course, besides the fact that it can take a lot of time, that is something that can take time, although the more you do it, you'll do it more quickly with time, is that the role of Targum doesn't make a lot of sense for many of us. Targum in the time of Chazal made perfect sense because the spoken language of even the Jews in Eretz Yisrael was Aramaic. Hebrew was like a more advanced language. So many people read the Chumash. They didn't know what the Hebrew meant. They look in the Targum. Baruch Hashem, now I know what the pasuk means. With us, it's exactly the opposite. We look at the Targum, it's incomprehensible. In fact, it's almost the opposite. If I want to know what the Targum means, I'll look in the pasuk and say, it's like, so what does Targum do for me if I don't get anything more from the Targum than I get from the pasuk, because the pasuk tells me what the Targum means. So because of this, there are poskim that say that Targum is lav dafka the Aramaic, but Targum is the translation of whatever language you understand. So as a result, many shitos say you can fulfill Shnayim Mikra v'yachad Targum by reading an art scroll or reading a translation that is faithful to Chazal. I don't mean translations that reject Torah Shebaal Peh and the like. That makes a lot of sense, and I tell people this, halacha l'maisa, that they can be somech on the translation of art scroll or the like. However, there are opinions that differ, and they say that even if you don't understand the Targum, but the Targum is also divinely inspired, Ruach HaKodesh, there's a certain kedusha to it, so you can't just switch it with another language. But I think for all intents and purposes, we can. Now the question that one might raise is this, though. whether my Targum is the Aramaic or whether my Targum is the art scroll, if I already know what the pasuk means, why do I have to read the Targum? In other words, why can't I just do Shnayim Mikra? Why do I have to do the yichud? I mean, if I read a pasuk and I know what the pasuk says, then what is the chiyuv of reading the Targum? I would understand if we would say, any pasuk you don't understand, you got to look at a translation because we want you to understand. But that's not the way the halacha works. The halacha works, you got to do it for every pasuk, right? So that I actually don't fully understand either. But apparently, the idea was that even if you know what the pasuk says, there may be nuances that are escaping you that the translation will focus your mind on noticing certain things that you might otherwise not notice. The tachlis of the mitzvah is very clear, that a Jew should be familiar with the Torah, right? The Torah is the foundation of everything. The Torah shebechsav is the foundation of Torah shebal peh. Every Jew should know the chamisha chumshei Torah. Okay, and therefore it's a very important mitzvah in that way. Yeah.
So it's like in Yiddishkeit, where we put a big emphasis on wine. Like
Wine,
all
yeah.
different things, like what's the deepness of wine and why do we use it for all?
Yeah, wine. So wine is very important in Yiddishkeit. Kiddush, Havdalah, Bris Milah, Chasana, Pidyon Haben, right? All of the happy occasions in the Beis HaMikdash, when the Leviim sang songs of praise to Hashem, it was on the wine that was poured on the Mizbeach. David HaMelech talks, well, number one aspect of wine is that wine is something that brings a person to a joyous state. You know, eating apples doesn't do it, right? But wine creates a certain inner joy, and therefore it fits Avoda Hashem. That should always be done with joy, and therefore wine is connected to that. The other idea is that wine, the Jewish people are compared to a vine, because just like a grape, by squeezing the grape, you get the best from it, you get its juice. So too, the Jewish people, by the suffering we go through, we become better, we become stronger. And therefore I look at the grape and I see that even though we suffer so much in Galus, it'll make us stronger and closer to Hashem. So wine is a very, very significant thing. Yeah.
What should be one's outlook on Jewish or even Christian archaeologists who try to archaeologically prove stories and events in the Torah, especially if sometimes they go against Chazal's mysteries?
Yeah, so the question is, what should our attitude be towards Jewish or Christian archaeologists who try to, well, either prove or disprove biblical events, and very often they will interpret the Bible itself, the Tanakh itself, not in accordance with our Masorah or our Torah Shebal Peh. So again, I know that it's always almost dishonest to be a little bit of a cherry picker, but I think, you know, when their results confirm what we believe, I think we should use them and point it out. When they don't, I think we may have to answer why, but we should understand that the Torah does not rise or fall. Not just the Tanakh does not rise or fall in archaeology. There are a lot of events that don't necessarily leave a trace in the world, particularly in desert climates or whatever it would be. So people say, for example, some people have argued there's almost no archaeological evidence of a whole nation being slaved in Egypt. Now, some Christian archaeologists have claimed to have found something, but a lot of archaeologists say there is no evidence this ever happened. Well, what do they say? Lack of evidence is not evidence of lack, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Meaning, not having evidence does not prove that it didn't happen, and therefore, ultimately, we still have to rest in emunah. So, I think you always have to be careful of don't put your eggs in one basket, because the tendency of people is this: if I come across an archaeologist that proves Matan Torah, I'm so excited, wonderful archaeology. Well, what if the next archaeologist shows you Yetzias Mitzrayim never happened? So the point is, if you're too impressed by archaeology, when it works for you, you're going to be very, very depressed when it doesn't work for you. So I think you have to understand that my emunah does not depend on any of these things. Yeah.
When we talk about gomel, or gmilus chasadim,
Yeah.
the word gomel seems to indicate reward or something deserved. We talked about this in a shir earlier this week, and so why is it then referred to as gmilus chasadim, which is good deeds, which are essentially supposed to be baseless from the heart, but then why is it talking about like being deserved or something?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, because normally when we say gomel is normally to pay somebody what you owe them because they have earned it in some way. And yet, gemilut chasadim is to give somebody loving kindness, which by definition they didn't earn, they didn't deserve, but you give it to them anyway. So I would suggest, Mo, though, that maybe that's exactly the point. The point basically is not that they did something to earn it, but gomel is give them what they're entitled to. A human being is entitled to chesed. Don't look at it like, I'm doing you a favor. Look at it as something that you are supposed to do. And therefore it becomes like something you owe the person, even though the maisa he didn't do anything that he would that you owe him, right? You see? So that's the whole point. In fact, even tzedakah is the same thing. Tzedakah we translate as charity, but tzedakah is also connected to justice. My obligation to take care of the poor is not just charity, I'll take care of you. It's a chiyuv. I'm a chiyuv to do it. I owe it to the ani to do it. So I think maybe that's the genius of using the word gomel for that. Yeah.
What are the requisites to be considered a mekabel, or what's the...
To be a mekabel?
Yeah.
Why, are you in the...
No, just curious.
You're applying... Yeah. What are the requisites to be a mystic, a mekabel, a student of Kabbalah? So the truth of the matter is, there's no official definition of what you have to do, but the standard list is, got to be 40, although the Arizal died at 39. You have to be married. You have to master Shas, the revealed Torah, the Shas and the Shulchan Aruch. You have to be a person with Yiras Shamayim who takes his tefillah, davens very, very seriously with a lot of kavanah. You have to be a person of good midos and character and Abbas Yisrael. And then you have to have a Rebbe that can indoctrinate you into this realm. You can't just do it by yourself. You need we have books of Kabbalah, of course we do, but you need a Rebbe to take you through it step by step by step. Now, I've already said a number of times that a little bit of Kabbalah is good for everybody. That even if I'm not on the Madrega and I didn't learn Shas and I'm not 40 and I'm not married, a little bit of the light of Kabbalah is something that feeds our neshama and can inspire us and can lift us up. And particularly Kabbalah as reflected through Hasidus. Hasidus kind of took Kabbalah and applied it in a more popular, accessible way. So that's not a violation. When we talk about mekabel, we're talking about heavy Kabbalah. You're learning Kisvei Ari. That's something that's not for most of us. But a little bit of exposure to Kabbalistic thinking is actually a very good thing. It's not something that you should avoid. And it's brought down that even reading the Zohar, some say even without understanding it, purifies the neshama. Many Sfardim have that position, that reading the Zohar. The others say if you don't understand it, it's not so kedai. But some say just the reading of the Zohar. So so the most important thing is it can't replace your regular Gemara learning, but it can add a very powerful dimension. What
should one consider while choosing a posek?
Yeah, what do you consider when choosing a posek? Yeah, that's a hard question, because choosing a posek is a little bit like choosing a wife. It's a delicate decision, and you need to have compatibility. First of all, you want to choose somebody. This is the most obvious qualification, who knows halacha, or at least knows the area of halacha that you're going to ask him about. If the guy doesn't know, then that's not going to be your posek. But second of all, you want to look for someone who is willing to give you time. Because sometimes a person's shaila is a little complicated. It involves knowledge of his past, his history, the different things they're going through, and that has an impact on the answer. And if the posek says, you got 2 minutes, I have a minute and a half to talk to you, that may not, even if the person's the gadol, that's why going to the gadol hador, people think, oh, the best posek, if I could get the gadol hador to be my posek. Not necessarily. The gadol hador is not going to give you that much time. I mean, if you go see Rav Chaim Kanievsky, you will get 2 minutes max. Now, 2 minutes may not be long enough, so sometimes you need, let's say, a lower level person in the hierarchy who will give you time. Third of all, you want someone who cares about you. And really, the two are connected, because if they care about you, they'll give you the time. And someone that is a bal midos, because one's ability to understand Torah will be a function of their bein adam lechavero and their midos tovos. So, there may be other factors too, but I would think those are the most important one. Torah knowledge, giving you time, someone who cares about you, someone with midos tovos in a general way. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Can one have relations with his wife while pregnant? If so, how can he if you cannot waste seed?
Yeah, so number one, it is absolutely permitted to have relations with one's wife when she is pregnant. And even though it is 100% true that it is almost impossible that she will get pregnant while she's pregnant, I mean, that would never happen. I mean, it can happen, but that's an unusual medical condition. It's not going to happen. It is not called wasting seed, because Rabbeinu Tam writes that the same principle that says a man can have intercourse with his wife when she's postmenopausal, or had a hysterectomy, or she's just old, is because the use of your seed to facilitate marital intercourse is not wasteful. It is doing the constructive function of generating marital intimacy. Okay, it's very important to understand that although having children is a very important mitzvah, it is not the exclusive reason to get married. There is intrinsically a holiness in the relationship of husband and wife, even if it does not result in children. Okay, we don't consider sexual intimacy between husband and wife as shameful. We consider it to be holy and special, and therefore it's not levatala, even though there's not going to be a pregnancy there. Yeah.
So you were talking earlier about Targum Onkelos, and so there's a Lamont Amar that says like the Shnayim Mikra of Targum refers to Targum Onkelos.
Yeah.
Since the Gemara specifically said, according to that especially, but since the Gemara specifically said, read the Targum Onkelos, does that make that the Targum more authoritative than all other Meforshim who are cholek on Targum Onkelos?
So, all right, so you are correct that, Onkelos is not the final word. I mean, Rashi sometimes is cholek on Onkelos. Chazal, Onkelos was the time of the Tanaim. There are other opinions in Chazal and Midrashim that are cholek on Onkelos. So if Chazal say Onkelos is the Targum, does that suggest that Onkelos has primacy of interpretation over any other opposing view? That's a very good point, but I would say it's very clear that that's not the case. In fact, sometimes the halakhic conclusions that come from Onkelos, we don't even paskin like. The reason why Chazal chose Onkelos is simply because Onkelos, unlike other midrashim, explains every word in the Chumash. So consequently, for me to say, learn the Medrash, it's not, number one, Medrash is like 100 times bigger. That's one problem. But number two, the Medrash does not comment on every single word in the pasuk. So if Chazal are looking for something that will take you through every single word, in those days, Onkelos was the best thing to have. But I don't think there was a suggestion that there's a bedafka dominance for Onkelos over other opinions. Yeah.
I heard some people say, well, if someone has a delete baton that's not made out of wool,
Yeah.
is it less yotze if it's made out of wool? Does it matter what material that it's made out of? And some people use like mesh. Like what's the?
Yeah. So there is a halacha that, according to many opinions, the only garments that are chayav in tzitzis min Torah are wool garments or linen garments. And for various reasons, we do not wear linen taluses or whatever it is because of a potential shotness problem with wool and linen. because tzitzis are generally wool. So so in a linen talis, you'd have a problem with woolen tzitzis. But wool, so consequently, if you eliminate linen as a talis material, then if I wear a nylon or a cotton talis, I'm not committing a sin, but I'm also not fulfilling the mitzvah d'oraisa of tzitzis. So as a result, many will prefer to wear a woolen garment because then they fulfill a mitzvah d'oraisa of tzitzis.
Is it possible to wear, you said that the garment could potentially, theoretically be linen. Is it okay to make tzitzits also out of linen?
Yes, you could do that, but there is a problem because it goes back to techeles. Even though the tzitzis could be linen, but the techeles tzitzis have to be wool. That's techeles by definition means blue wool that is dyed that color. So consequently, when you had techeles, you had a problem of the wool in the linen tzitzis. So therefore, some authorities say that we should not get into the habit of wearing a linen talis at all with linen tzitzis, lest we do so when we have techeles, and there would be a problem.
This is only theoretical. No one ever wore a linen talit.
Well, this is a real complicated sugya. There are opinions that say that if you wear a linen talit, you will actually put in wool techeles. Other opinions would say there's a problem. So because of this, the minhag has been that we don't wear a linen talis at all because of problems with techeles, problems with shatnez, and the like. Yeah.
Why are certain fruits not bound by hilchos shmita, and why is there an exception given for a fruit like such if completely consumed without wasting any of it?
Yeah, why are certain fruits not bound by the laws of Shemitah? What are you thinking of? Because that you could mean a few different things.
For instance, I emailed the Rabbi about lemons that I got without a hechsher.
Oh, okay. So let me explain that. This actually ties into what I talked about mamash this afternoon, and that is, in order for a fruit to be bound by the laws of Shemitah, it must have budded during the Shemitah year, which means if it budded before Shemitah, even if most of its growth is during Shemitah and it's harvested during Shemitah, it's not a Shemitah fruit. It's equivalent to a 6-year fruit. So a lot of the laws that apply to fruits in the first half of the year is not a special rule about the fruit. It's simply because halachically it is allocated to year number 6. Okay? Later on in the year, it will have those halachas because it'll be a fruit that budded after Tishrei. Remember, for Shemitah, we don't look at Tu B'Shvat, we look at Tishrei as the allocation point for fruit. Okay, now what was your second question?
And so, why is the exception that it just needs to be completely consumed normally, but without any waste?
Oh, so these are halachos because when the Torah says what you do with Shemitah produce, so the Torah emphasizes li'achla, you are permitted to eat it. So Chazal have a drasha that li'achla means you can't waste it, meaning these are halachos. Shemitah fruit is considered kadosh. And because it's kadosh, you cannot treat it with disrespect. And therefore wasting Shemitah fruit is considered to be a disrespect to that which has the holiness of Shemitah. But as I say, if the fruit is allocated to year 6, it doesn't have that holiness, so that law would not apply in that case.
Wouldn't then at least the seeds, if not also the peel, need to be of some purpose as well?
So on that we say no, because the Torah requires consumption for the portions of the fruit that are generally edible. The portions of the fruit that are not edible don't have that kedusha, right? So as a result, the peels and the seeds can be thrown away because they were never edible to begin with, and therefore their kedusha does not require achila. Yeah.
I could be wrong about this, but from what I understand is once Mashiach comes, there's no more like tshuva. Yeah. If that's the case, then like how does one wholeheartedly bow to Mashiach if there's like, first of all, a lot of like not religious people, and then also like some person could feel like, oh, like kind of want to extend the clock, like wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
It's obviously it's good, but.
Yeah, that's a very excellent question, and that is, we all pray for Mashiach, we're all supposed to yearn for Mashiach, we're all supposed to want Mashiach. Question is, why is that so? If we say that once Mashiach comes, you're not going to have necessarily the chance to do tshuva, you got to do it before Mashiach comes. So maybe I don't want Mashiach to come yet, both in terms of people I care about who have not yet done tshuva, and in terms of me, there's stuff I got to do tshuva for, and I'm not ready. So Mashiach is not an uncontaminated blessing. There's going to be some hard aspects. So I think the short answer is, in some ways, that praying for Mashiach is actually very altruistic. I am praying for the glory of God to be revealed in the world, even if it hurts me a little bit, because I'm not ready. I love Hashem so much, I want His glory to come to the world. Now, by the way, it's not quite true that you can't do tshuva when Mashiach comes. Certainly you can, but it'll be less significant because when Hashem does all these miracles, then, it's obvious you'll be inspired. And therefore it doesn't count as much. That much is true. But it's not that the gates of tshuva are going to be closed. But as I say, one might look at Mashiach as altruism. I love Hashem, even if it's maybe not the best thing for me.
For the others, also.
And even for the others. I want Hashem's glory to be revealed to the world. Yeah.
Unfortunately, in a lot of even very from homes, there's a trend now. Unfortunately, a lot of kids who've been raised from leave home and don't always stay from. I want to know as a parent or as some kind, what could I advise the parents to not have to at least to do something, not have their kids go leave from home.
Yeah, so the problem is the phenomenon that is known as off the derech, or kids at risk, and this can happen at any age. This can happen in high school, this can happen in college, this can happen even after that, in which a child might be not a Baal Tshuva even. The child was raised in a frum home, and the child went to yeshiva all of his life, and the child might even be in kollel, I'm aware of some cases, and they go off the derech, they just stop believing, and the like. And it's not, I'm not going to say it's always the parents' fault. It may not be anybody's fault. Things just happen. But the question is, are there things that parents can do that maybe reduce the risk of this happening? Not eliminate it, but reduce the risk. I think basically there's one fundamental thing that can be done. That is, there has to be a feeling in the house of Torah and mitzvahs as something that is joyous and not burdensome. Far too often, even people who are from, they sometimes convey the idea of Judaism as very oppressive. Can't do this, can't do that, can't do that, can't think this, can't do that. And it takes out the joy, and it takes out the simcha, and it takes out the enthusiasm. And at some point, a kid might say, why do I have to suffer? Everyone else is enjoying life. Everyone else is having a good time. Why can't I have a good time? Why can't I be like everybody else? Now, obviously, intellectually, there are a million answers you can give to that, right? Obviously. There are many things you can say. But emotionally, a person says, why do I have to suffer all my life? So, if we could find ways in our homes to create a Yiddishkeit of simcha, that can make a real big difference. And I would say, in some ways, that's even more important than giving great and detailed philosophical answers to how do I know the Torah is from Hashem. That's important. But people don't change their lives that much based on some philosophy, some long answer to prove that the Torah is min hashamayim. They say, okay, that's nice, I hear you. But people will live their lives based on what they feel is meaningful to them, what is fulfilling to them, what gives them simcha. So we have to create that atmosphere. And sometimes we're a little remiss. We're a little remiss at not creating a simcha in Torah and mitzvahs. Now, of course, the problem is that all parents face. You want to teach your kids a certain thing, you got to have it yourself. Meaning, if you're not an oved b'simcha, then how are you going to teach your children to serve Hashem b'simcha? So when we talk about what do I teach my children, we're also talking about what do you teach yourself, right? What do you teach yourself? You have to be your own Talmud in that way. Yeah.
Recently, Center did a trip up north, and we went to the kever of Rabbi and other Jewish individuals. As Rob might know, all of those bodies or remains have been removed by archaeologists in recent history.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile with that in terms of the archaeological role and in conflict with the Torah in terms of remains needing to be?
Yeah. This was raised last week, and it's tremendously disheartening. What can I say? This is an absolutely despicable, deplorable desecration of holiness. This would be true even if they would have been like regular people. This would be a tremendously bad thing. And the fact that these were chachamim and maybe members of the Sanhedrin makes it so much worse. And one even wonders, what did these great tzaddikim do that Hashem would allow such a desecration to their bodies? What type of kapara is going on? I don't know. So all I can say is, I said I would try to find out a little bit more about it, but it's horrendous. And I'm sure, how many years ago was this, did you say?
I think the tour guide told us it was somewhere between the 30s and the 50s when the modern Medina was formed.
Yeah. I think the laws are a little stricter now than they were then. I think it's less likely that this would happen. Also, the Haredi community is more active, so there would be more demonstrations than perhaps there were. But this is awful. This is something that's absolutely forbidden. According to halacha, not that they care, but according to halacha, it was absolutely forbidden to do such a thing. And and I think really it's okay. I'm not going to compare it to the Holocaust, but it is a crime against humanity, at least on a lower level. Something that's a very, very serious thing. So I don't know. They don't know where the bodies are. Is that right?
That's my question. I don't know where that is.
Right. I said I would try to find out. I didn't have a chance.
Notes, and after a generation or two, then it gets passed on to the children, but they're like chicken scratch notes that are hard to read. And
So
maybe there was approval from the newly formed state. There wasn't. There was
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
So I don't.
So what can I say? It's like asking me, what is my opinion about mass murder? I'm against it. I mean, there's not a lot to say. It was an awful, awful thing to do.
Very sad.
Yeah.
This is kind of a two-pronged question, but which did Rashi work on first, Talmud or Chumash? And then why does Rashi switch from Aramaic and Hebrew in his, in his comments?
Yeah, which did he work on first? I believe Gemara was first. That's what I believe, but I'll try to verify it. Now, when you say switches from Aramaic to Hebrew, what are you referring to? In the Gemara or?
I guess, is the Chumash, is his commentary on Chumash all in Hebrew then? Or?
The commentary in Chumash is Hebrew. It's Mishnaic Hebrew, so it's rabbinic Hebrew.
Okay.
It's not biblical Hebrew, but it's not Aramaic, no.
But in the Gemara, he definitely switches between Aramaic and...
Not too much. Rashi's commentary in Gemara is also largely Hebrew. I mean, the Aramaic is the Gemara. In other words, Rashi will bring the words of the Gemara and then explain them.
Okay.
So the Aramaic component will be the words of the Gemara, usually. Now, the exception would be that sometimes a klal, a well-known principle, is known in the Aramaic more than the Hebrew. So Rashi may refer to principles of Shas in Aramaic because that's how we know them. Unlike the Rambam, by the way. The Rambam meticulously, and sometimes it's awkward, the Rambam meticulously translates into Hebrew every Aramaic expression in the Gemara. Which means the Rambam makes up kind of awkward phraseologies, which are not familiar, other than one who learns the Rambam, because the Rambam does not want to use any. I believe in the whole Mishnah Torah, somehow, I think 2 words escaped his translation, that he used 2 Aramaic words in the whole Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is 99.9999% Hebrew, and every Aramaic klal of the Gemara is translated into Hebrew. But Rashi didn't go that way. I think Rashi was using the more familiar, so that would be the key, where the Aramaic klal is the familiar way we refer to things. So Rashi will use that familiar language. I think that's what's going on. Yeah.
This question was sent in. In the been suggested that most of the Gedolim were, quote, non-conformists. Is that accurate? And what does this mean in a system that thrives on conformity?
I'm sorry, say the end of the question again.
What does this mean in a system that thrives on conformity?
Yeah, that's, in other words, were most of the Gedolim non-conformist, and what does that say for a system that requires conformity? Excellent question. We're running late. I guess I could excuse myself. We're running out of time. Basically, most Gedolim were nonconformists, but that's the nature of greatness, and that's the nature of genius, that by definition you cannot be put into a box. However, the problem is that conformity is something that most people need to a certain degree, because if they're simply given unstructured time, and they're not told what to do with the time, they won't necessarily know how to fill it. So they need a certain structure, a certain predictability. When you're very great, you can go on your own in some ways. So that's part of it. Now, it is very, very true that yeshiva culture over the past, really since the Holocaust, since after the Holocaust, has become progressively more conformist. If you go back to the so-called golden age, Slobodka, Mir, Kamenetz, in Europe, the famous European yeshivas, you will find a lot of individuality, a lot of creativity. People dressed differently. Not everybody wore black and white clothes. People wore colored shirts and striped suits and different things. The notion that people are supposed to dress the same and think the same, that's kind of post-Holocaust to recover from the trauma we wanted to create a strong, unified community. But it's not necessarily the best thing. And I think that people need to be in touch with their creative side. But on the other hand, we also need structure, meaning the Gadol may be able to create his own type of life. Most of us need some more guidance, I think. That's kind of what's going on. Okay, all right, be well and take care.